Hello and welcome to the Founder Files. Today I am speaking to Mike Scott. Not only is Mike an incredibly respected entrepreneur, but he's been a mentor to myself and Brett in our journey with Metavolve so far. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Mike is a true entrepreneur at heart. He only signed his first employment contract at 40 when NONA Digital was acquired by Yoco, so he has a very decorated history. Mike was the owner and CEO of TsTec, based in Cape Town, for almost 17 years before being the co-founder and CEO of NONA Digital. NONA was acquired by Yoco for a significant but undisclosed valuation before he worked there as the head of partnerships until parting ways very amicably with Yoco to be an entrepreneurial coach and facilitator. In this episode, we get really deep into the psychology of entrepreneurship. We chat about Mike's origin story and how his experiences in childhood and first-time business ownership really shaped his identity. We talk about the survival mindset of a first-time founder and the learnings required to elevate that mindset to one of abundance and success. We talk about the mistakes he made at TsTec and the lessons he learned for the rest of his career that he applied at NONA Digital and he shares with other founders to this day. We then switch gears to NONA Digital and discuss in depth how he implemented scaling up and how working hard at their positioning was the root cause of his success. So you get an absolute masterclass on how they spent 2 years working on their market positioning and how it led to all of the outcomes that they got to, including their exit. Mike also then shares a very honest telling of what it was like to be acquired and to work for someone else before transitioning into coaching and continuing to add value to founders. This is a conversation that will make you ask yourself the hard questions, but if you do, then I have no doubt that this has the potential to be a life-changing episode. Enjoy.
So our first whole project was 8,000 Rand. By the time we got acquired 10 years later, in Rand value, we weren't really doing work for less than probably 600,000 or 800,000 Rand a month. You can just see the growth, right?
What was essentially now your secret sauce in NONA that you were able to convert into language that your target customers that you've now focused on and positioning yourself in front of made them really want to buy from you?
So if anyone's into crypto, Tezos was a client of ours. The co-founder of Ethereum was a client of ours. Verida was a client of ours. I can go on.
I'm afraid of making this decision because I've got nothing to fall back on. I am terrified of going all in because I don't know where this is going to go. And that usually comes from issues around childhood of not having the sense of security, not having the sense of safety.
So $60, $70 an hour, losing some work because we've been told we're too expensive. But by the time we had drastically improved our positioning, we were landing projects at around $200 or $250 an hour, right, for the same work. And we had more work than we could do.
Welcome to the Founder Files, the podcast that's like eavesdropping on a conversation with a successful entrepreneur over a fireside chat. Join me, Cameron Coots, through this unique experience of unfiltered stories and insights from scaling founders around the globe as they share their ups, downs, and everything in between.
Mike, welcome to the Founder Files. It's absolutely amazing to see you again. It's great to have you on the podcast. I mean, it's about time that you're able to join us for this. So thank you very much, and I can't wait to get into this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm honored to join the guests. I've seen some of the previous guests, and I'm in good company. So I appreciate the invite.
So Mike, let's get straight into it. I really want to talk to you about all the journeys you've been on as an entrepreneur. I mean, one of my favorite things that I know about you is that the first time you ever actually worked for anyone was after exiting NONA to Yoco, and then your first job for someone else was at Yoco. And I definitely want to circle back to that because I think that's going to be a very fascinating story. But you are an entrepreneur, born and bred. That's what you've done your whole life. So NONA is the story I want to get into about the growth, the exits. I think it's a fascinating one. And I'd love the audience to hear it. But to give the context of Mike Scott as an entrepreneur, I think we need to go back to your first business, which you started in 1999, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, to be more accurate, I actually didn't start it. I'll use a funny term now, but that was an acquisition. It was an acquisition for, I think, about 8,000 Rand in total. So it was massive, right? Headline value. Yeah, huge. So I'm being a bit facetious, but truth be told, I actually didn't start it. I bought it from my cousin. And, that company was TS Technologies. It still exists today. The T standard for Tseng, which was Jack Tseng. And the Scott was actually not me. It was my cousin, Damien Scott, who's gone on to be an exceptionally successful entrepreneur, massively in Silicon Valley. He's just exited his business and he's onto the next thing. So he actually started the business a couple of years before that. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, I started a business. I paid him, I think, 8,000 Rand, and that was basically just for the computer that was in the business and a little bit of stock, right? But I'm kidding when I said it was an acquisition. So yeah, that was my first sort of real business. I mean, as with most entrepreneurs, I've always done things to make money. From the age of like 6 years old, I would put a basket on a skateboard and fill it with washing things and going wash cars when I was like 6 or 7 years old around Hout Bay in Cape Town. And so it went and so it went and so it went and so it went. Probably a function of growing up in a very loving family, but a family without lots of money. Like, we didn't have a lot of money. You know, we grew up in a 90 square meter house. I've got 3 brothers. We're not small people. I'm 6'5" and 100 kilos, 4 big boys, mom, dad, 90 square meter house. Like, not a lot of money, lots of love, lots of support, but just very clear from very early on that we have a huge amount of support, but no one's coming to save us from a financial perspective. Anything we do is going to have to be done ourselves. I wouldn't change that, just to be very clear. I grew up with a lot of very wealthy friends because of the schools that I went to. And I wouldn't change it. But it was stark, that anything that we make for ourselves from a financial perspective, we're going to have to make completely on our own. So it wasn't really a thought or a deliberate thought. It just kind of happened. I hope my mom and dad don't listen to this, because I always say something that sounds quite harsh and most people laugh at. And I say, like, both my parents were entrepreneurs. They were just really bad entrepreneurs. And I feel bad saying that because that's sort of objectively true. But at the same time, they survived, right? And they raised us, and they didn't have a ton of debt, in fact, any debt. And they just hustled. They just sort of survived. So that was sort of passed on to us, I guess. I mean, 3 out of the 4 of us, in fact, we're all entrepreneurs. 3 out of the 4 of us have built significant businesses. The other one just isn't particularly driven by that kind of success. So definitely sort of planted in there. And I think that's like those roots stories. Now that I'm doing a lot of one-on-one founder coaching, they really matter. It really matters to understand one's own, I don't know what the words are here, but like founding stories and belief systems and eccentricities and insecurities and the stories that we tell ourselves. And I'm 40, and only now am I really starting to see the real value of understanding those things, not just from a personal growth perspective. Like, this is an entrepreneurship podcast. I'm being specific about entrepreneurship. Like, understanding that stuff has a major impact on how we show up, make decisions, lead, manage, strategize. And I'm only realizing that at 40. Like, if you're listening to this podcast and you're 25, start caring about that, because you will be a better leader if you understand that stuff. So yeah, hell of a long answer to a very simple question. Short answer is yes, first real business at 15 or 16 years old at school. Sorry for derailing.
No, that's fine. I think before even getting into TsTec, I want to unpack that a bit more. So you say that a lot of these really formative beliefs around childhood. I mean, you talk to anyone who's got even a tiny bit of understanding about psychology. It's like we know this. Everything in childhood will kind of shape your belief system and your subconscious later on. But how do you relate the importance of this to entrepreneurship, and why is that something that's important for other founders to really get into and understand?
I mean, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist, right? So I'm speaking purely from experience and observation, which is going to be very biased. So just take that with a pinch of salt, right? So there's no theory. This is just experience. Motivation really matters. Like, it really matters in a negotiation, in an employment, in a transaction, in anything. Motivation really, really matters. When you understand your own motivation and when you understand somebody else's motivation, there's a very different conversation and transaction and transfer that's happening than when you don't. That's one thing. I don't know if it's possible to understand our true motivation until we really understand ourselves. And understanding ourselves is an incredibly difficult lifelong pursuit. I mean, what did it say on the Oracle of Delphi? Like, know thyself. And I'm not a religious person at all, but if you go into most religious scriptures, I'm quite interested in that stuff. There's an element of this as well, is that the primary work is like to know yourself, right? That's really difficult. Without that, there's no originality. You're just kind of like doing things without knowing why you're doing them. The best leaders and operators and business people that I've come across are very intentional, very deliberate, very clear. I don't know that you can get to that clarity without sort of a deep understanding of yourself. Maybe you can. Like I said, don't listen to me, listen to the psychologists above me. I'm just speaking anecdotally and from experience. So the more I understand about myself, my motivations, my insecurities, my fears, my drivers, the better I'm able to make decisions, to know what I'm good at, to know what I'm not good at, to know where I should let things go, to know where I should hang on, to know what I should do, to know what I should delegate. You might be thinking, what the hell has this got to do with my childhood? I think it's got everything to do with our childhood, because it's like the motivating factors, right? And you just have to look on LinkedIn or wherever, and they'll talk about you shouldn't do everything just because you can do everything. You should only do the things that only you can do. What is your zone of genius? What is your zone of competence? What is blah, 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 blah. To me, that stuff's easy when you've done work. That stuff just shows itself. And until you've done that deeper, harder work, I kind of feel like we're just guessing a lot of the time. So, yeah. This is pop psychology. Don't take what I'm saying too seriously, anybody, least of all you, Cam. It's just my observation and my rambling. But for me, it makes a lot of sense. And the work that I do now, which is, split between leadership teams and one-on-one founders, I'm just seeing this more and more and more on the founder journey with the people that I work with. High-performing people, usually there's a pretty damn clear set of narratives or single narrative that's really getting in their way. It's holding them back from getting to that next level, breaking through that ceiling, whatever that means for them.
Yeah. And I fully agree. And I think there's a huge need for just entrepreneurial mindset. And besides getting into strategy and all the other services to help guide entrepreneurship to thrive, the biggest one that I find around mindset is got to do with, why are you running this business in the first place? Where do you want to go? And what do you believe about yourself in terms of getting there? And to equate that quite practically, some of the simplest obstacles are fear states, right? I'm afraid of making this decision because I've got nothing to fall back on. I am terrified of going all in because I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if we are capable to do this, and the doubt around getting this deal or getting that partnership. And the point underpinning that is that that usually comes from issues around childhood of, not having the sense of security, not having the sense of safety, not being able to tap into the abundance mentality that you do have. And one of my simplest hacks to that is just simply asking yourself the question of either one of the two of, if I had no fear, what would I choose to do right now? Or the other one of, if I knew everything was going to be okay, what would I choose to do right now? And that's a way to ease out of that. So, changing gears. Going back to TsTec. So tell me about, the founding story is you bought the business for $8,000, right? A laptop and pretty much that's about it, as you're saying. Right, but now, you led the business for almost 17 years and then you exited it. And this is a whole IT services company. It was based in Cape Town, still is based in Cape Town. I think just to get the context there, it's like 17 years is quite a long journey. Can you give me one of the early highlights of trying to really find and establish that business's fit in the market and what that chapter looked like?
So, yeah, that business I think of as, how do I put this? Where I learned a lot of lessons on how not to run a business, right? So there are not many pearls of wisdom that I can draw out of that business beyond don't do that, right? That business was, almost everything I did was reactive. Almost everything I did was based out of a place of fear, and making a decision out of a place of fear is just never a good idea. Your actions and your thoughts and your decisions that you make when you're coming from a place of fear are very unlikely to be the right things, right? So a lot of the work that we have to do, I won't derail again, but a lot of the work that I think we have to do if you do suffer from a lot of anxiety is to actually do that work first. Because while you're coming at things from a place of anxiety, your quality of decision making is just drastically reduced, as is your action, etc. So a lot of that state that I was in for the vast majority of me running that business was coming from a place of fear. Also, just bear in mind, I was 15. and then 16, and then 17, and then 18. This was not like, I was not thinking about this like a super strategic mastermind. This was just like, hey, this is cool. I can make some money and go party with my friends right now, rather than studying and having to pay for myself and take out loans and get into debt and then wait 4 years before I could earn. I was like, forget that. I need to do that now, right? So you give me a lot of credit by saying, tell me how you figured out product market fit. I didn't. It was all just completely reactive and responsive, right? I think, as with most entrepreneurs, I can sell. So that's what I did. I would just like go, cool, the solution to my problem is to go and get more clients. So I'd go and get more clients. I wouldn't have a process. I wouldn't have policy. I wouldn't have structures. It was just like, just sell and then like figure it out later, right? And I did a lot of that stuff. I mean, just to give you context, I'm 40 now. So this was in like 1999 when we started this. So just like you said, you bought a laptop. I didn't buy a laptop. I bought a PC because no one had laptops then, right? This is what we're talking about. So just to give you an idea of like how my brain works, that was still like 56K dial-up time, right? So if you listen to this podcast and you're younger than like, I don't know, 35 or something, you probably won't even know what that is, but it was like brutally, horribly slow internet. ISDN, not even ADSL or fiber, ISDN was just coming into South Africa. So Telkom could provide the lines, but literally Telkom didn't know how to install the modems. So this was just like how my brain was. I was like, well, I've got to try and figure out how to get these modems. So I somehow figured out how to get these ISDN modems, not even routers, modems, but no one knew how to configure them. So I don't even know how I figured this out, but I figured out how to like configure ISDN modems. And then Telkom would actually call me when they did an ISDN line installation. They'd say, hey, can you come and do a modem? Because we can't terminate the endpoint. So I would like be installing modems for Telkom for like, I don't know, 150 Rand installation fee. I mean, this is not great business, right? This is not scalable leveraging business. This is like learning hard lessons, right? Telkom's the one making money. I'm the noob, basically making them look good and just allowing them to keep repetitive billing and making no money and selling time for money and all these things. So no, I didn't hit product market fit. The difference though is in a tech infrastructure business, or I think they'll call it a managed services business now, there's a couple of things that are interesting about that kind of a business. They're very unsexy. They're completely thankless because nobody is excited to spend money on their IT office infrastructure. Like no one, right? So at best, your clients are like indifferent. Like at best, they're just like not complaining. But usually they're either complaining or they're saying, hey, nothing's going wrong with our system. Like, why are we paying you so much on maintenance? And you're like, well, nothing's going wrong because we're doing the maintenance, right? It's a very thankless job, but it's kind of like recession proof. So it's very unsexy, but everybody needs it, right? At that time, though, without getting into too much detail, it was a lot harder than it is now. Like, not everything was cloud-based. Everything was on-premise. Everything was manual. Nothing was automated. It was like really hard. It was a tough sort of business to run. So, I won't speak much to product market fit because that wasn't even a thing that I understood at that time, right? It wasn't a thing. It was reactive. One of my biggest lessons, though, in that business was I did everything myself in the beginning and then obviously started employing people. I didn't have any clue how to employ people. Eventually employed this guy who was kind of like my lead technician. And we started doing things that were above my technical capability. So he was way more skilled than I was technically. And we were installing like managed exchange services and exchange servers and things like that. And just out of my level of technical capability. I don't think he meant to do this, but we got to a point where he just completely and utterly had me by the balls. Like, I just was beholden to him. I was so scared of losing him. I thought that the business would absolutely crumble if I ever lost him. And I made a ton of terrible decisions after each other. I don't think he did anything wrong, to be honest. I think this was my mistake, not his, to be fair. He was not a bad dude. But it was, this went on for years. And that was one of the biggest, hardest, deepest lessons that I learned in business. Eventually, he did leave. And guess what? The business flourished, like, typical story. But probably the hardest lesson I learned in that business was never get into a situation again where you are completely and utterly at the mercy of a key person. So this isn't even like key person dependency, like if they're hit by a bus. This is like when someone that works for you completely and utterly can hold you to ransom. That is something you have to avoid, like at all costs. And there were a few massive lessons. That was probably the biggest one. And when you're in a technical business, that relies on sort of just consistently leveling up, that's something that can creep up on you without even kind of realizing it's happening. And I need to just repeat this. It doesn't mean that like he's a bad person, because it's not necessarily coming from a malicious place. It can just kind of happen in a way that you sort of find yourself in the situation, which is an incredibly dangerous and bad situation to find yourself in. So yeah, not really any nuggets on product market fit. It was more a case of like react to everything, react badly, react out of fear, react out of desperation, and just hope that everything's okay. Not a great way to run a business.
Well, I mean, the way that you describe that is the way that most first-time founders end up running their business. It's this whole realm of, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. I just know that I'm able to make a deal happen. And then the first couple of deals is like, oh, I'm surprised that you're buying. Okay, now we need to deliver. Cool. My 2 cents on the critical key person dependence that you've mentioned is, I think there's this transition that founders and founder-led businesses need to make, where you go from being very people-centric to suddenly being quite role-centric. And this is my view around the difference between being a startup and being a business. And my point here is that it's very normal to have a critical dependence on a role. It's very abnormal to have a critical dependence on a person. So what I mean by that is that if you map out the responsibilities of your CTO role, and this is the stuff that needs to be done because the business cannot function without those tasks being done. That's very fine and normal. But then with that, you're in a position where you can find people that can fit that criteria. But until such point that you do the thinking around what that role requires for the business and does for the business, then it's just about the person. And that person, then they leave and you're terrified of that happening. But the reason why it's so fearful is because you haven't thought about what is the actual job this person's doing. And in your situation, it's just this person. And if this person goes, everything's going to go to hell, right? But then realizing that, okay, well, there's multiple jobs this person did that other people can do. And it's just that experience of realizing that after the fact. But it's just that emotional separation between the person and what the job is being done.
You know, Michael Gerber, I love Michael Gerber's thinking on this. For the audience, if you don't know who Michael Gerber is, he wrote a book called The E-Myth Revisited. It's a great book. These are my words, not his, but one of his sort of key messages is that, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's, we need to build businesses that very mediocre people could actually be employed and the business would still be fine, right? Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. That does not mean you don't put a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of resource into hiring and keeping the best possible people that you can and building an environment in which they can do their best work. That's not what it means. What it means is if your business relies on certain individuals to put in heroic efforts, you're not building a resilient organization. And this has been a theme throughout. So as we moved on to NONA, which we'll speak about later, we had an exceptional group of people. But again, this kind of cropped up, is that we started realizing, hey, we're successful, but if we're really honest, we're only successful because of a handful of people are putting in like unrealistically heroic efforts here. They're not sustainable. Like, this is not healthy. It's not actually a good indicator. And I see this a lot. With the companies I work with is, hey, are you successful? Yeah, we're killing it. How do you know you're killing it? Well, here's the revenue, here's the profit. Cool, that's good. Show me how you are splitting up your tasks. Oh, I'm the founder and I wear 7 roles of the 9 roles. Cool. How's your mental health? Terrible. How's your family life? Atrocious. Are you really killing it?
Or are you killing yourself?
The only metric is not just, or are you killing yourself? The only metric is not just revenue and profit. And I'm not even trying to be like holistic here. I'm just saying, like, how sustainable is that, right? Now, the core sort of message I'm trying to get across here is, like, you need to look at your business and hopefully your revenue is growing, but revenue I don't care that much about, to be honest. Hopefully your profit is healthy and hopefully you're, above all else, generating cash, free cash flow. Cool, great, that's good. But then you look at your business and you go like what level of effort is who putting in here? Are there heroic efforts required here? Now, if you're an early stage startup, that's just the name of the game, man. Like, you're going to do that. But there's a point at which you need to actually be pretty intentional about going, I need to get this business to have people that are not required to put in heroic efforts in order to be sustainable. That's a harder trick. Why? Because that now requires much more clarity on roles, like you were talking about. Like, what are you actually accountable for? What are the 5 to 6 things that every role is delivering to the business and being measured on. That's a harder trick to actually get to that simplicity, because you only get to that simplicity when you actually deeply understand the roles in the business. We could talk about this for hours, but like as a simple anecdotal message, if you're listening to this and you're running a business, be honest with yourself and say like, if you are successful, if you're not successful, fine, do what you have to do. If you are successful, just have a look. Like, are we successful because of heroic efforts of one person, 2 people, 3 people, 5 people? The harsh reality is that might sustain itself for a while. But to ask this question constantly, like, how sustainable is this? It gets pretty confronting. But until we do that, and until we can actually acknowledge and accept that, we just have no chance of beginning to work towards a situation where heroic efforts are not required. One final point on this. It's not that heroic efforts should never be required. I think it's actually super helpful. Not helpful. I think it's super healthy to have like really intense short periods. I think it's good for people, objectively. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I just think that like it's good for people to have like short bursts of very high stress, but not forever. When it's forever, that's really damaging, as we all know. But short, quick, very high stress bursts, and then sort of like marathon pace, I genuinely have observed and experienced that people thrive, most people, on those sorts of things. So yeah, just back to your question, because I'm sort of taking this all over the place. Yeah, absolutely nothing to share on product market fit, because God, I didn't even know what that was at the time. What I was trying to do was just survive and not die.
And on that note, and for the record, I just love the conversation going in different directions. That's why I approach the founder files like I do, is the fact that there are founders like yourselves that have been through this before, that have these lessons that organically come up, and I love sharing that. So that's always why I say just I'm a podcast host, not an interviewer. We're just having a chat, and please just bring all the tangents. I love the tangents. So you mentioned is like, okay, you had no idea what product market fit was. It was actually like with the curiosity of bringing speaking to it as what does it look like when you have actually no idea what it is. But then you also spoke about now. You were working with Telkom, at a time where one of like the biggest like telco in South Africa, and you are the one helping them be able to provide their services. You've got this critical dependence on a person that they ended up leaving, and you realize wasn't as critical as you thought. So I do want to kind of get through this, but I just know that there's other nuggets here because of the first-time founder, young first-time founder. So what would you say are like the main successes and how you achieve them in that 17-year period? And let me caveat that question with your 2020 hindsight glasses on.
Yeah. So look, I say this with like, I kind of laugh at this, but genuinely, I think, and this isn't an arrogant thing, it would almost be crazy if I couldn't do this, but what took me like, I don't know, 10 years or 15 years to achieve then, I honestly think I could do in like less than 1 now, right? And the reason I'm saying that is like I would bloody well hope so, actually, right? Like that isn't a boast. It's more like if you can't, then what the hell have you been learning?
Mm.
But the reason I'm saying that is it's easy when you know how, right? It's easy when you know how. But when you're 18 years old and you don't have any money and you can't pay suppliers, you very quickly got to learn what cash flow is, what a P&L is. It's not a theoretical thing anymore. It's like, if I didn't get this right, I remember I said like no one was coming to save me. So like if I didn't make money, there was no money. There was no parents that would pay for my rent or buy me a house or whatever. Like it was me, or like that was it. Like there was nothing there. There was no safety blanket at all. So that like one of like the successes, this might sound a bit weak, but it was like it was lessons. It was learning. It was like I can think in a cash flow like in my head because I had to at that time. Like I see cash flows like in my head. It's not very complicated, but it's like it's so drilled into me like how to manage your cash. It's one of the most like useful tools that you can have in business. Yet so few founders actually have a very simple week by week or month by month or even day by day cash flow like Excel spreadsheet that tells them when they're going to run out of cash. Like whenever I give this to a founder, I'm like, use this. It'll give you an early warning system. It's incredible. And they're like, Jesus, how did I not like, even my accountant, we had a chartered accountant at NONA. He's really smart. He's an amazing guy. Like He can run circles around me from a finance perspective and an accounting perspective. But even he was like, geez, Mike, this is actually like a super useful tool, right? So the things that I learned the most were actually like real life lessons on what matters in accounting, what a cash flow statement is, how to run an active cash flow, what P&L is, understanding VAT, like how does the stuff actually work outside of a theoretical principle and inside of like a survival principle. I think the other thing that I learned was, again, these are like almost eye-rolly, they're so simple, but like you just have to be able to sell. You have to be able to sell. You don't have a business until you have a paying customer. If you can't continually get customers and keep customers, you don't have a sustainable business. So whether you like selling or don't like selling, I don't particularly like it, but we're doing it all day, all the time. Daniel Pink wrote a book called To Sell is Human. He's not a sales guy. He's a great author. He wrote Drive, which is one of the best books I've ever read on human intrinsic behavior. You're selling all the time. You want to get your kids to go to sleep, you're selling to them. You want to, I don't know, convince someone to date you or marry you, you're selling to them. You're negotiating a business deal, you're selling. Sometimes you're selling to yourself. Do I get up or do I sleep in? Do I go and work out now or do I watch Netflix? You're selling all the time, always. So get good at it. Get good at selling. Call it whatever you want. Selling. I had an amazing mentor for many years, very, very successful businessman in South Africa, was the MD of one of, if not the biggest retail stores. And he used to say to me something which still confuses me today, but it adds a lot of value to me. And he used to say, Mike, there's not a lot of problems that sales won't solve in the short term. That's a very loaded statement. On the one hand, he's saying there's not a lot of problems that sales won't solve, but in the short time. It's not just about sales, right? So I think one of the big lessons was like, I learned how to sell. I learned how to sell well, and I learned how to convey value to a potential customer. That might sound really simple, but it's like anyone who's listening to this who is a business owner will probably relate to this, either because they are good at sales and they get frustrated because other people can't sell like they can sell, and they never will be able to. I hate to break it to you. As the founder, you will always be the best salesman in your business. Others might listen to this and go, I can't sell, but that's not my zone of genius, and that's my excuse for not needing to sell. I've got news for you. When you're a small business, you just have to sell. If you've solved this problem without needing to sell, amazing. And some businesses do. Those are the best businesses in the world that figure out network effect or figure out channels or partnerships that they don't need to sell through. Great, amazing. Like then you've solved this problem. That's probably why you're running a $100 million business and not struggling as a small fledgling startup or services business. So I think like learning to sell CAM in a very difficult environment where nobody wants to buy what you're selling, but they have to. It's a grudge spend. Were good lessons. Getting like really down and dirty into the weeds when you need to was a subliminal lesson that I didn't even know I was learning until afterwards. What do I mean by this? Part of leadership is being willing to do whatever you expect other people to do. Now, it gets to a point in a business where that becomes impractical, right? But that's a bigger business, especially in your formative smaller years. You need to be checking yourself all the time as the leader in the business. Am I asking people to do things that I am not willing to do? Am I asking people to exhibit behaviors that I do not exhibit? Am I asking people to do things that I won't do? And the sad thing is that that's really common. It's really, really common. It's do as I say, not as I do. However, you know, if you're listening to this, if you look at the best leaders that you've worked under or the best managers that you've worked under, one of the reasons you'll think that they're great is because they didn't expect you to do what they weren't prepared to do. It's because they modeled the behaviors that they held you accountable to. You might not even realize that, but if you look at it, I can almost guarantee you that that will be a part of why you resonated with them. There'll be other reasons as well, with leadership and clarity and purpose and coaching and those sorts of things. But that was another big thing, is that I just instinctually knew that I had to be the first one in and the last one out for a time, not forever. I had to be willing to do whatever I was asking them to do. That was just sort of intuitive. And then it actually became codified, and it's something that we brought into NONA in spades and in a much more sophisticated way, but the same concept. I think one more that I'll share, which is something that is interesting, especially when I speak to my coaching clients these days. Coaching, when I'm working with clients that have a large like very important supplier relationships. Okay, so like at NONA, this was not relevant because we didn't really have suppliers, really. Like our suppliers were like, I don't know, AWS, right? Okay, like you don't speak to anyone. TsTec was very different. We relied very, very heavily on our suppliers. What we were doing, we were either buying and selling computer hardware, technical hardware, or we were installing that hardware. Counterintuitively at the time, I sort of recognized that it was really important for me to invest very heavily and treat my suppliers amazingly well. Whereas the prevailing knowledge or the prevailing sort of wisdom at the time, and even to a point today, is that your suppliers are lucky to have you as a customer. That's not a great way to view suppliers if you rely on your suppliers, right? Because there will come a time when you need to lean on your suppliers. There will come a time when you need something from them, when you're late on payment, when you need a favor, when you need something. And you need to be building up credibility. You need to be treating your salespeople that are selling to you well. You need to be treating your suppliers really well. You need to be paying early. You need to be paying in advance sometimes. You need to be building up goodwill. You need to make it an absolute pleasure for you to work with them, because probably sometime in the future, you're probably going to need them in some way, shape, or form, right? That was not common at the time. I don't think it's common now, right? And depending on who you sort of take advice from, often it's like, oh, until you've really screwed your suppliers and got an extra 1% out of them, that's your job, procurement, bullshit. Like, sorry, I just call total bullshit on that. The relationships that we developed with our suppliers were a massive part of our success. Now, that business was not big and it wasn't a hugely successful business, but like we did do some things quite well and we did have some success. And a lot of that success actually came from one particular supplier that I invested very heavily with the salespeople, with the ownership, with the management, with how we paid, how we treated things. And that would come back in spades. We would get first, like my sales guy would tell us before a special was even coming out, hey, Mike, heads up, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but actually this is coming up, so don't buy this, buy that. Or he would say, hey, this is coming in, you want to buy stock of this because there's a big order coming in and it's going to be da-da-da-da-da, or whatever. And it's this attitude of shifting from, hey, suppliers are lucky to work with me, to they are a key part of my business, of my supply chain, of my existence. I'm going to treat them really, really well. And actually, this came from a mentor of mine who was an exceptionally successful, not an entrepreneur, but a very successful businessman, also in retail in South Africa, managed multiple billions and literally thousands and thousands of people. And I was friends with his son. And whenever we went out for dinner as kids, I was friends with his son as kids, they were very wealthy, but he would always tip exceptionally well. And years later, I asked him, like, what's that all about? And he instilled this in me. He just said, it's really simple. You treat the people that are quote unquote serving you better than anyone else treats them. You treat them in a way that they really want to continually do business with you, to continually serve you, to continue to do this. And that is what builds the fundamentals of these relationships. Now, this guy had supply chains that were doing billions and billions and billions and ran one of the most successful retail companies in South Africa. So, yeah, I mean, there's tons of lessons, but I think I'll stop there for now because, I'm trying to draw on lessons that are not like super specific to that business or that industry, that are kind of universal. And those are some that just sort of jumped out.
So if I had to summarize that, it would be 1, it's the ABCs, always be closing. 2, it's a combination of, I'd say, accountability and integrity, right? It's just the character of just showing up of do I say what I'm going to do? And am I going to show up with accountability that this is my business at the end of the day and the buck stops with me? And am I going to act like it? And then thirdly, I think the way I would summarize what you've said about the suppliers is there's a difference between a supplier that supplies you and a supplier that services you, right? And to that point now about treating them super well is that they're going to then service you. And it's a counterintuitive narrative towards, because you're the customer. And a lot of people view being the customer through a lens of entitlement because I'm paying you for X goods or service. And it's only when you treat that as a strategic partnership, and if you make it a joy to service you, how much easier that will make your life in business and how joyful that will make such a critical function of what it is that you do. And Mike, I think the fourth lesson there is, again, why I just really enjoy talking to you and why I've got so much respect for you, because my question was, what are the main successes and how you went about achieving them? And the answer was, these are the main lessons and how I think about business forever because of that. So thank you.
I mean, Cam, that's it, right? Like, this business was not a massive financial success. So when I think of this business, it's like, wow, those lessons, very painful, most of them, were the value. When I eventually sold the business, it was nothing impressive, nothing to write home about. There was a big lesson when I sold it, which I'll touch on if you want to, but this was not a financial, it was objectively a financial success, but nothing impressive, right? Like nothing to write home about. So then what is the value, right? The value is, okay, well, what did I learn from that I could then take into my next business? And that chain continues, right? So, I mentioned my cousin who has had way more success than I've had. I mean, it's at a sort of Silicon Valley level scale, and I don't even know the numbers, but he exited his business quite recently, and it would have been for a very large amount of money. And it was just fascinating because he came to visit me in Adelaide recently, and he's very calm and very measured and ultra intelligent, and he's made like never work again money, right? But his whole take on this is like, now I'm ready to start my real business, right? So he's like, he's had crazy experience, he's had crazy amounts of success. He exits a very significant business, but his view is like, oh, but that's just learning. It's just continual learning, and he kind of views this, what most people would probably view as like the big thing, the big event that then sends them off into the sunset and never works again and has an amazing legacy and story. He's like, no, that's like just another step. Now I'm ready to start a real business. And, I must be careful what I talk about, but like, he's told me what he wants to do. And it's just like, it's just massive, right? So it's this it's kind of like this beginner's mindset all the time. What can I learn? What can I learn? What can I learn? What can I learn? And it's really hard because the world puts you on a pedestal. The minute you've had like any kind of success, then everyone's like, oh, come and talk and this award and that, da, 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 da. And it's really hard because your ego gets in the way and you're like, oh, I know my shit. I'm amazing. Everyone wants me to talk to them. And you got to take a step back and go like, in my case, like I've really done very little, and it's really very small. And it's really like, there's just so much more to learn, so much more. And there's so many things that I did wrong and so many things that we could have done better. And it took us so much longer than it like should have taken us. And it's actually very difficult because your ego gets in the way and you start thinking like, oh, I've done a thing that's really hard. We did this thing that most people didn't achieve. And then you just get in your way. You just get in your way of learning. And, I'm running I don't know what it's called. Like some company's running, a very cool company in Adelaide is running this like accelerator thing. And they've asked me to facilitate like the first day. And basically like the message I want to get across to these sort of younger businesses, I don't actually know many of the businesses. I assume they're quite younger, smaller businesses, is just kind of a deep passion and commitment to like execution, like to action. And my observation in myself, to be honest, and in others, is that like the biggest killer of that is ego. The biggest killer is like, oh, I know this. Oh, like I know that. Oh, I know this. Whereas if I think back to like the earlier years, when I would sit with a mentor and like they would even mention like a book or a framework or a tool, I would like that night go and like study it, read it, make sure that I'm like just getting every single piece of possible information I could get from that person. And I've noticed that there's like a direct correlation between that stuff, right? Like the people that are just like super hungry for knowledge, super grateful for having access to people who've done stuff that they're trying to do, and just going and just absolutely devouring and basically executing and their success versus people who are like, oh, I know that. I don't need that. I know what to do. I don't need external information or what have you. Direct correlation. And I think it's quite insidious because when you've had some success, your ego sort of jumps up and then your openness decreases and that beginner's mind sort of decreases. Where if you look at some of the most like impressive people in the world, you'll see that there's an amazing amount of curiosity in a lot of these people. They're like ultra wealthy, ultra successful, ultra this, ultra that, and yet they're asking the most amount of questions. They still want to learn. They're just open. They're curious. They just want to learn. They want to learn. And that's, to be honest, that's been a struggle for me. Like it's your ego goes up and then you realize, oh my God, I've done nothing in comparison to like most people. But then someone else will put you on a pedestal and then it goes down and then it goes up and then it goes down. And if you're a person that can keep we were using this word earlier, equanimous mind, I'm just learning. I just can never know it all. I've just got to learn. learn, figure out what excellent looks like, emulate that, execute. I think that's an incredible attribute and skill, and something that I see more and more and more in ultra successful people. Some of the people I work with, mega successful, but their open-mindedness and their curiosity is just like, it's just so inspiring, because they're killing it. Way more success than I've had, and yet they just want to know. They want to learn. They want to learn. They want to learn. They want to learn. They want to learn.
So I couldn't agree more. And I think curiosity and learning is critical. And in terms of two different personality traits, I think this is where a lot of people can get maybe confused in how they view themselves and in relation to others. But the opposite of self-confidence is self-doubt, right? But the opposite of humility is arrogance. And these are two different things. So the point is, it's the opposite of, people think the opposite of confidence is humility, and the opposite of arrogance is doubt. And these are two different dimensions. And the reason why I bring this up is because the thought I had when you were sharing that about curiosity, I was like, yes, I fully agree. But when do you celebrate? When do you look back and acknowledge that was still good enough, that was still successful to me, that I can do that? And I think that's also a fundamental part of the journey, because looking back, I feel like when we talk about this journey, it's very difficult to enjoy the journey moving forward. It's also very difficult to enjoy it in the present, because it's not exactly, especially in Western society, not what we're like trained or wired for. But having these small little milestones where that was great, I did well, I'm really happy with that, I'm proud of the team, I'm proud of what we managed to achieve. It's those moments and the lessons as well that I think make the journey so worthwhile. And I think it's what I've found in my personal experience is in this, because I value curiosity and I value humility, I've doubted myself in moments where, can I celebrate that success? Can I acknowledge that no matter how big or small it is? And just in my own relationship with myself and figuring that out is it's possible to do both. And I think it's super healthy to be able to do both as well. And that's just my 2 cents on that.
I think it's super healthy. I think it's critical. I experience that as extremely difficult and extremely rare. So I have absolutely no argument in anything you've saying at all. Nothing. My experience share on that is, let me put it like this. In our weekly leadership team meeting at NONA, we literally built in a discipline that basically was celebration. Why did we build in the discipline? Because we never, ever did it. We never did it, right? We had to literally learn and force ourselves to celebrate, because what would happen, and I've seen this time and time again with high performing, let's say in quotation, high performing people, is 99 things would be going amazingly well. Revenue would be up, margin would be up, free cash flow would be up, we'd win an award, land a new contract, I don't know, hire some cool people, you name it. But one thing would be wrong. And all we would fixate on would be the one thing that's wrong, even if it wasn't big. That's all. And it wasn't on purpose. It was just where we went. It was where our minds went. And I think it's quite natural for entrepreneurial type people to be in that mindset. It's not healthy. Let me be clear about this, but it's rare. So I still struggle with that today. I did a little post on LinkedIn today giving a share of the first 6 months that I've been doing this coaching stuff full time. Quite a vulnerable sort of share, which I like doing on LinkedIn because I often get good kind of feedback and direct messages, and I find it quite good for accountability and reflection. I've worked with the stats are on there. I think in 6 months I've worked with 14 businesses. I think 6 one-on-one relationships with founders, and probably total number of people probably about 70 people. Net Promoter Score is I think 9.89. One person out of all of those people didn't like the work that I did. It wasn't even a client. It was a person on the leadership team of a client. One. That is all I ever think about. And I see myself doing it. And I still can't stop. Right? I'm not saying it's good. If you're listening to this is not me telling you to do that. This is me saying don't do what I do. I just fixate on this one person. I allow this And he's not even doing anything wrong. Like, he didn't get value in what I was doing. Of course, not everyone's going to get value in what you're doing. Like, of course, you shouldn't try and make what you're doing valuable to everyone. But that's all I can think about. It's all I ever think about when I think about value, when I think about, ratings. And then I start telling myself the stories. But, the other 69 people that rated between 9 and 10 and have given me like this feedback and that feedback, they didn't actually know, and so the story begins, right? But here's the thing. I think this stuff exists on a spectrum, right? Like, we talk about imposter syndrome. That means different things to different people. To me, it's this feeling that like you're going to be found out. That when people actually realize that you don't know what the hell you're doing, it's all going to come crashing down, right? It's this feeling of like when they realize. I don't think that's unhealthy. I actually think it's pretty healthy as long as it's sitting in a healthy point on the spectrum. I think no imposter syndrome whatsoever. I think that could be arrogance, narcissism. I don't know. Like, I don't know if the complete absence of like, is what I'm doing really valuable?
Well, then you lack an awareness of your own limitations.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. The other side of the spectrum, when it's at a 10 out of 10, well, then you're just operating in a place of panic and fear, and it's just horrific, right? You actually can't do the work because whatever the work is, because you're so consumed with how people are perceiving you that it's equally uncomfortable. Something to share here, though, was a very cool observation and insight by one of the guys on our senior leadership team at NONA, a very cool guy. He shared it in such a cool way. He was like, we all think that everyone's like watching us and that people care about like what we're doing, and you look like an idiot, or you're an imposter, or you're amazing, or you're dressing well, or you're not dressing well, and he's like, I used to care a lot about that. And then I had like a really big realization that like nobody's watching you. Everybody's just worrying about their own shit. Everyone's caught up in their own insecurities. Everyone's caught up in their own world. Everyone's thinking everyone else is watching me. No one's actually watching you. That's actually a bit more depressing when you realize that. But when you realize that, like, no one really cares. No one's really reading your LinkedIn posts and paying deep attention to them. No one's really following your journey to the extent that you think they're following your journey. No one's really sitting waiting for your next thing. Like, they're caught up in their own worlds, man. Like we all are. And that's very liberating. It's also a little bit depressing because you kind of realize you don't matter that much. And that's, first it's depressing, then it's liberating. But it is liberating. Like, everybody is on their own journey. Everyone is sort of battling with their demons, and they're different, right? Like, your story is not my story. This might sound like, what are these guys talking on an entrepreneurship podcast about this stuff? Like, it's got everything to do with entrepreneurship. It's got everything to do with leadership. When you're taking care of and building on all of the parts of you are the asset. You're going to be able to show up as a better leader. You're going to make better decisions. You're going to lead people and inspire people in a better way when you're modeling and you're working on yourself. And you've heard me yammer on about this a lot, Cam, but this kind of realization that like self-care has got nothing to do with you. It's got to do with the people that you serve, right? It is a shift in how we lead and how we do things. And I think, again, like a reflection back to TsTec days, I honestly thought that like it's just about working more. It's just about getting in that extra client, getting in that extra delivery, getting in that extra thing. And like, unless I'd worked 10, 15, 16-hour days, I hadn't actually shown up. Luckily, I think that narrative is changing a bit. But then it shifts into, okay, well, if it's not about just putting in more time, then it is about doing the right things and the important things and the things that bring leverage and the things that bring exponential growth. But how do we figure those things out? Well, we have to be better at decision making. How do we get better at decision making? Well, we need to reduce the narratives and the stories and the fear and the anxiety in our brains. How do we do that? Well, we need to work on ourselves. So you start to see these really clear connections of like, oh, okay, if I can get my mindset right or better, I'm going to be clearer. I'm going to take on information better. I'm going to process it better. I'm going to make better decisions. Why are the top CEOs in the world paid so much? Fortune 500 CEOs? It's because they're better at making decisions than the other guys. And when we start to sort of see these correlations, it's just so stark. It's so obvious, And in a coaching capacity, it's just amazing because you get to sort of work with these high-performing founders or low-performing founders, to be honest, but just founders, right? People, cool people. And quite often you realize that they're so caught up in their own heads that they can't see the most obvious thing because they're just too close. They're smart. They know what it is. And sometimes you just kind of hold up a mirror or as my coach used to say to me, it's really hard to read the label from the inside of the bottle. But so often now, I'm sitting with a leader, smart person, successful person, gets it, and I'm just like, this is so obvious. Like, they can't see this. This is like actually amazing. And you sort of, guide them down a bit of a journey, ask some questions, and they're like, oh my God, how did I not see that? Jesus, that was so obvious. That happens a lot. It happens a lot when you're able to have like proper, deep conversations with founders. And I think a lot of this work that we have to do as founders, as leaders, is it's not like you don't work on strategy. It's not like you don't work on the business. Don't get me wrong. But like the work begins on your mindset, on the clarity, on getting yourself into an equanimous state so that you can make better decisions, which have exponential effects on your organization. That's difficult and requires a lot of work and is still not, I would say, generally accepted by business culture. It's still thought of as like a little bit woo-woo and a little bit over there. The more I see this stuff, the more I saw it in myself, the more I've seen it in my partners, the more I've seen it now in my clients, I have such high levels of conviction that this work is actually like one of the biggest levers you can pull that results in sustainability of businesses, bottom line results, staff retention. I see like a direct connection and correlation.
I fully agree. And I think some simplicity on the other side of all this complexity for me boils down to one word, and that's perspective. And you talk about the Fortune 500 CEOs and their ability to make good decisions. You can talk about your own mental health and well-being and values and why you care and showing up as a good leader, etc. It's just perspective. And the fact that you can't see the wood for the trees and this viewpoint that might be obvious, it's just perspective. And what this reminds me of is a comparison towards burnout. And there's a quote that I like that says, if you don't, and I'm butchering this, but if you don't intentionally choose to rest, your body is going to force you to do so at a time that's not convenient. And the same thing applies towards knowing thyself. And there's a couple of founders that I've spoken to, and there's some very successful founders coming onto the podcast pretty soon, and successful in a South African context. And what they did is they exited their business, and it was making R1 billion a year. And they exited just before COVID and then had a sabbatical during COVID. They've never had a greater existential crisis in their lives. They went from having this extremely high-performing, high-running business, everything was orientated around that, to now not having anything to do whilst being stuck in your house. And what are the questions that they ask themselves? Who am I? What does it mean to me to be a father? What does it mean to me in terms of being a husband? What is it that I actually care about? What makes me interesting outside of my business? And all that work that they did, and now they're leading another business that's also extremely doing very well. But the difference in their approach, and this is just from they're not even on the podcast yet, but this is just from the first initial conversation I had with them. Their ability to lead now is far more profound, obviously because of the experience and learnings they got from the other business, but especially because they did the work to ask themselves the hard questions, because they now understand how they show up in their business as a leader.
Well, I think that distinction is important, right? I certainly live this. Most founders live this. But you are not your business. You are not your business. And yet, most founders, most of us, our identity becomes completely intertwined with our business. Like, we are our businesses. That is an incredibly unhealthy thing, because businesses fluctuate. Businesses lose money. Businesses make money. Businesses are in good standing in the media, bad standing in the media. Like, when we tie our identities to our business, we're giving away any hope of happiness and contentment, because now our happiness is completely reliant on an entity that we don't have control of. Like, you don't have control of the markets. You don't have control of all the things that can go wrong in businesses. You just don't. And it's fascinating. Depending on what I'm doing if I'm working with a one-on-one client, not a leadership team, I'll often take the founder through similar to what I'll do in a business, actually, like a vision sort of piece and a bit of a strategy piece. And then we'll look at some values and goals and behaviors and all that sort of stuff. Pretty generic stuff, but can be very powerful. Recently, I was working with an awesome client of mine. I love this guy. High-performing guy, very successful, super open-minded, really enjoy this guy. he came and he did his work on his kind of vision stuff. We were using like the Collins Porras framework, which is a business thing, but we were using it for personal. It's pretty good. Check it out. And the top left-hand side, he had his company logo. And I was like, that's interesting. We've done your company vision stuff. We've done your strategy stuff. We've worked on the business side. This is your personal one. But I see your company logo. And that is a real story. But he got it immediately. And then we started unpacking this process of, you are not your company. You are the custodian of your company. You are responsible for your company. Your company might bring your livelihood. But if that company had to go away and you have your identity completely and utterly intertwined with that company, you will be destroyed as a human. And that happens. People lose their businesses. They get exceptionally depressed. Very sadly, there's often suicide. I don't know the stats, and maybe I'm going into a place here that is not a safe place to go, but I would venture a guess that those suicides, that depression, is not actually based on money or a lack thereof. It's based on a loss of identity. Who the hell am I? I've given 10, 5, 15, 20, 30, 40 years of my life to this company, this entity that I created, and it's gone. Now I'm hollow. I get that. I get that. I've lived that. I suspect people listening to this are living this. But it's a kind of word of caution, I would say, is that you are not your business. You are the custodian of your business. You have an obligation and accountability. But when we can separate our identities, weirdly, in my experience, you actually become a way better leader, a way better operator, because you see the distinction. And you see yourself as a custodian, a driver, a value adder, et cetera, but you separate it from your ego. Don't want to necessarily go down that path. Again, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, but it's like just through observation of myself and others. When we can separate our identity from our businesses, weirdly, there's a kind of a freedom that happens and a bit of a space. And my observation, just purely through observation, you actually become better as a leader, and you become better because there's a slight detachment. There's a bit of space. You're less reactive, better decision making. It's all about decision making, right? And again, I just want to be clear, don't take what I'm saying too seriously. This is just my observations, just my experiences. If you're getting deep into the stuff, go and speak to a psychologist or someone who actually knows what they're talking about. This is just anecdotal. But I've seen it and I've experienced it badly. Let me say that, not in the positive sense, in the negative sense. And it's big, right? It's profound. And you're just gonna hear me continually doing this, Cam, is we speak about business, and that's cool. And I love business and I love working with people. But the more I do it, the more the work just comes back to the self. Just comes back to the self. How do I remain equanimous? How do I keep my cool? How do I not allow myself to spiral into doubt or fear or depression? How do I take care of myself? How do I find a pace that is maintainable forever, not just for a month? How do I do these things? When we can do these things, we become the platform on which the business can just be built better, right? And this shit is hard.
Yeah.
This stuff is difficult, especially with A-type personalities, because it requires a degree of vulnerability, right? And most of us in those types of situations, the types of people that we don't want to admit that weakness. We don't want to talk about that weakness. But it's one of the reasons I started doing what I'm doing now, is because when we can find people like us that have done these sorts of things, that get it, that can create that space and have these conversations, and you go, oh my God, it's not just me. Jesus, okay. Actually, that guy who I put on a pedestal, he's pretty fucked as well. There's there's an openness, right? There's an opening to talk about this. And I can tell you, because I have the luxury of speaking to a lot of founders, most of which society will put on a pedestal. Guys, we're all dealing with shit, man. We're all dealing with shit. The difference is just there's often more zeros or less zeros on the end, but it's all there. I have not met the holy grail human who's got it all sorted out. So yeah, there's just this. I might sound like I'm going off, but I'm really not. The more that I think about this, the more that I observe this, it is about taking care of and first and foremost working on the asset, and the asset is you as the founder before the business. You take care of the asset at the same time of the business, you're going to have a better chance of long-term success. You don't, you might still have success in the business, but at what cost? And that's a very confronting question, right? But I'll leave it at there. I won't go on too much about that.
Let's pause here for a moment. If you've made it this far into the episode, it's probably because we're talking about things that you're trying to implement in your business. You found your sweet spot in the market, you've gained momentum, and you've already been through a phase of growth. Because of this, you know that on the outside, growth is super sexy, but on the inside, it's incredibly difficult to achieve and to sustain. So now I've got a question for you. Now that you know the sacrifices it takes to achieve growth, how much time are you currently spending thinking about your direction and your next phase of growth? I bet not as much as you'd like, because you're still in the thick of it. Leading, deciding, pushing for performance, pursuing new opportunities, maybe even thinking about selling the business. See, your story is yours. But this chapter where growth meets complexity, this is when things get hard. Because you can listen to insights from podcasts and stories from people that have been there before, but applying it to your context is a completely different ballgame. So let me help you. If you want to have a 90-minute, no strings attached conversation with me, then head over to Metavolve's website in the description of this podcast below and let me help you navigate this next phase of growth. Because at the end of the day, building a great business is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated.
The only thing I want to say there before moving on to the next topic is you keep giving the disclaimer of you're not a psychologist, you're not a therapist, this is just observation. So one thing I want to say is I'm a psychologist. I know what I'm talking about. And I just want to say to the listeners is so does Mike. So keep bringing those lessons.
I've just got to be careful. You know how it is. I've just got to be careful because pop psychology is dangerous and I don't want to claim that I know what I'm talking about, but I do want to share experience.
And thank you for sharing that. Genuinely, this has been awesome, and I'm excited to hear more of it, especially now because I want to change gears and get into NONA, right? So talk to me about that journey, because now, obviously there's a bit more recency to that. We can talk about the point of identity of being an entrepreneur this whole time. I can't wait to get into what you're going to discuss about identity in terms of going into Yoco and then becoming a coach as well. But I think just to give everyone a bit of the context and story is, and maybe let's blend them together. Let's quickly just talk about the short exit, the short version of the exit story of TsTec, and then the founding story of NONA.
Yeah, so TsTec was sort of, it was going. I wasn't enormously passionate about it. It was a good business, not a great business. There were some good people in that business. In fact, some of those people have been there for like 15 years. It's actually quite amazing. So TsTec was sort of running. I had an office. I think we had about 15 or 20 staff. I'll sort of merge the founding story of NONA together with it because it's all kind of one and the same thing. I had a very good friend at the time who I'd helped out with some stuff, and he actually came and sort of temporarily was working for me at TsTec. He was like, Mike, you've got to meet these two guys, Ed and Gord. They're like, Ed's just this crazy smart dude studying actuarial science. And Gord is this amazing designer, and they're good mates, and they're like, you got to just meet them. So I didn't really take them too seriously, to be honest, but I met them, and they had this little like side hustle where they were designing websites, like WordPress microsites. So they seemed pretty cool, and I asked them like if they'd build a website for me because I needed a new website, and they did it. I think it cost 9,000 Rand, and it was amazing. Like the experience was awesome, and that was different for me because up until that point, a lot of my TsTec clients, when people don't know about anything tech, they just kind of think that like a techie is a techie. So they kind of think like, oh, this guy's fixing my computer. Surely he can build a website. Like, no, guys, these are very different skills, but whatever, you're not really listening. So they would be like, oh, well, if you can't do it, can you find someone who can? And then, me being a hustling entrepreneur, I'd be like, cool, I can put a 20% margin on this, and I'd go and find someone who could build a website. And it was just a terrible experience every time. Then I met Ed and Gord. They built a website for me, and I was like, geez, that was amazing. They did it super quick, because it was the end of the year and they needed money for partying. So they built it really quickly before the Christmas holidays. And then they're like, please pay me. And I did. And they were awesome. And the website is, it was great. And I offered them a job. I said, hey guys, come and work for me. And they were like, we won't work for you, but we might work with you. So I was like, oh God, I don't, and here's a big lesson actually. Up until that point, I'd always been 100% shareholder of the business. And up until that point, I was like, I'll never have business partners because I'd had some sort of false starts with some pretty terrible temporary business partners. I was like, I'll never have business partners again. Always be 100% shareholder. Fast forward to today, and actually having worked with exceptionally awesome human beings like Ed and Gord and Dave and Jared, I will never start a business on my own. I have done a full 180 on that. I will never, ever start a business on my own. It's shit. It's lonely. It's hard. It's not a life worth living for me. Maybe it is for you and your listeners, but for me, it's about the people, right? And that is not a belief that I held until I was like, 30 something. So we sort of said, okay, well, let's just spin this thing up called NONA. And I'll be honest, this was in 2012. And honestly, for me, it was like, hey, this is a little bit of extra money for some, beers with the boys on a Friday. Like, that's how I viewed this. It's a side hustle that now when my TsTec clients ask me for websites, I can go, actually, we do that and we can do that. Our first job was, I think it was for 4,000 Rand, right? And we actually never got paid for it, which is quite funny. So our first job was 4,000 Rand. Just to give you context, by the time we were acquired, my memory is a bit hazy now, but I don't think we had a client that was paying less than probably about $40,000 a month.
Sure.
So our first whole project was 8,000 Rand. By the time we got acquired 10 years later, in Rand value, we weren't really doing work for less than probably 600,000 or 800,000 Rand a month, I think. I could be a bit off on that, but you can just see the growth, right? If you had told me in the beginning that that's where we would get to, I would have laughed at you and said, forget it, no chance, you're dreaming. So with this NONA thing, I was now effectively running TsTec. NONA moved into TsTec's office. We were able to sort of incubate NONA at like no cost. We were able to get clients from TsTec to sort of seed, I guess, in terms of clients, NONA. But I was quite distracted now, obviously. I'm kind of running two businesses. Well, I wasn't running NONA then, but I was like involved in NONA and running TsTec. So I won't bore you with the details, but pretty quickly it became pretty evident to me that, NONA's actually got a lot more potential than TsTec. Actually, that's what my focus needs to be. So that was clunky and messy for a few years. I can't remember how. And eventually it just became really clear to me that, I can't be spending time on TsTec anymore. I have to be putting all my energy into NONA. And this is almost embarrassing to say, but like TsTec was profitable, but not enormously profitable. And when I sold TsTec, I didn't sell it for a huge amount of money, but it was like at a profit. And this was kind of embarrassing, but this was a long time ago. But it was the first time I actually had the experience of going, shit, this business has got value beyond just the money it makes. It's got value as an entity, right? And why that was sort of profound for me, and if you remember, I didn't go to business school, I didn't go to university. This was all learning on the job, right? All practical. What I mean by that is, when we're building businesses, it's my belief that we should build them as if we're going to sell them from the beginning, even if you don't intend selling them. Because if you build as if you're going to sell, the way that you treat your expenses, the way that you treat your compensation, the way that you treat your tax, your cash flow, your debt, all of the stuff is very different, because you have this view of like someone's looking in all the time. So for example, we had a data room ready pretty much for a long time before we were acquired, way before we were even thinking of selling. We had this discipline of, not completely, but to a large degree, keeping an up-to-date data room. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. When you're running your business, even if you're like right at the beginning, as if someone is going to buy it, the decisions you make, the accountability you take, the responsibility, the management is going to get better, because you have this view of like someone is watching, and whatever I'm doing is going to have an implication on the value of this business. It begins to build a trait, which I think is one of the most valuable traits in life, which is like, how do I behave when nobody's watching? To make a very simple example, if you're walking down the street and there's no one that can see you and there's some litter on the pavement, do you pick it up or do you walk past it? But nobody's going to ever see it. No one's ever going to commend you. What do you do? And how do you take that through your life? And this is like a bit of a forced habit to do that to yourself in business. How do you act when nobody's watching? That's what really, really makes for amazing people and amazing businesses. But I digress. So coming back to this, sold the business. I actually sold it to a very good friend of mine who kind of wanted to buy a business, and it was just very fortuitous. So it was a really clean sale. He's a very good dude. He's grown the business quite a lot. It still exists today, which is kind of cool for me. It's just a cool story that it's actually still alive and still business and still growing. And like a lot of the staff are still the same staff, which is really cool. So I sold that business to be able to just fully focus on NONA. So that was sort of the end of an era. I would be lying if I said I was sad to see it go. That business, I had a love-hate relationship with, for sure. It was most of the time in that business, I felt like the business owned me, not that I owned the business. Most of the time in that business, I was like, what is this bullshit about being an entrepreneur and getting all this freedom? I don't have any freedom. I didn't take leave for 10 years. Literally, I didn't take leave for 10 years. And I was like, what the hell? This is bullshit, right? Obviously, it was all me. I was the problem, not the dream. So that was great to let go of that and be able to fully focus on NONA. So that was kind of the end of TsTec. I'd like to think it's a really nice end to the story. Even though it wasn't life-changing money or anything, it was still a successful sale. It was still a good legacy. The business still exists. Like that is hard to do, right? Like it's hard to build a business. It's hard to keep that value going. So, I'm proud of that and really happy about that. Was it significant? Not at all. But it employed 10, 15, 20 people. Today, I think it employs about 25. So yeah, that was the end of TsTec. And I like to think about that as kind of like the business that I learned a lot on how not to run a business, that I could then begin to sort of undo some of those mistakes as we went into NONA. Make no mistake, we made a lot of mistakes at NONA. I made a lot of mistakes at NONA, but a little bit, slightly fewer than I did in the business before. And I'd like to think that the next business hopefully will be slightly fewer again. And so we go.
So you had a lot of lessons from TsTec, and you mentioned that you had no idea how to be able to spot product market fit when you had it. And from my understanding, that's a very different story in NONA, because if you look at NONA's positioning statements, very short one, NONA accelerates product development for growth stage fintech and blockchain companies. I mean, that's very niche, but also incredibly clear. And what the audience might not know is that you went on a very deliberate journey around your positioning as the founding team. Can you talk to me about that and what the lessons you got out of that were and what the results were of deliberately focusing on your positioning?
You're being very kind saying deliberate. I would say extremely painful. So that journey was expensive, scary, like pulling teeth, but ultimately very rewarding. So we were a software development company, right? The fact is, whether you're building software for a medical company or a fintech company or tool manufacturing company or whatever, it's the same thing. Software is software. You're writing, our stack was React and React Native and Node on the back end and AWS. Like that doesn't change, right? I'm not a developer, but it doesn't change. So there's an argument to be made to say, well, we can't niche. That's stupid, because if we're building for medical or this or that or whatever, it's the same process. And that's objectively true. But positioning is not about what you...
true. It's not true to the market.
Exactly. Positioning is not about you. Positioning is about the people you want to serve, right? So we sort of noticed that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think at that stage we were probably averaging, at the point that we decided to really start understanding what positioning is firstly, and then what our positioning should be. I think we were probably charging on average about $60 or $70 an hour is probably what we were fetching at that time. And at that time, some projects that we were quoting, we were being told, we're not going to go with you because you're too expensive. Okay? So $60, $70 an hour, losing some work because we're being told we're too expensive. I'll start at the end and work backwards. By the time we never finished our positioning, I don't think you finish it, but by the time we had drastically improved our positioning, we were landing projects at, memory might fail me here, but I think around $200 or $250 an hour, right, for the same work. And we had more work than we could do. We were growing, our margin was higher, obviously, much higher. I want to repeat that. We were losing work at $60 or $70 an hour, being told we were too expensive. Then we went through this positioning process, which took us about 2 years, I think. And we were landing the same work at, what's the math on that, 4 times the rate. And we had more work. We were winning more work. That's the power of positioning. Now, what is positioning? Okay. You all would have heard the phrase, if you try to be everything to everyone, you become no one to no one. That's very true. But it is very scary to go on this journey. Why? Because unless you venture backed and you have a massive runway, which a service business never has, you have to learn and experiment on the fly while you're trying to keep the lights on, while you're trying to pay, in our case, 35 odd, very high salaries of very good engineers and designers and project managers. It's a very scary process. Positioning is more an exercise in courage than strategy. Okay, so I won't get into huge amounts of detail, but you need to start by understanding who your target audience is and why. So if you want to work in our case, this took us a long time, but if you land at going, cool, we want to work with fintech and blockchain scale-ups that have raised north of probably about $20 million, that takes a long time because you need to be able to ask why. So why do we want to work with them? Well, in our case, we figured out that the stuff we're really good at is building things when they're not safe to fail. So we weren't a good shop to come to just build any old thing. We were probably too expensive. Didn't matter. Building a banking product or a fintech product or a blockchain product where massive amounts of value is being handled and stored and processed, we're probably a good fit. Okay, so which industries care about that stuff? Got pretty quickly to like blockchain and fintech. Okay, I'm massively paraphrasing here. This was a lot of work. You get to a point where you're like, oh my God, we have nailed our potential client. Like we've nailed it. We want to work with this kind of company at that stage. These are the personas that we want to attack. Amazing. We've nailed it. We've got it. We've solved all of our problems. We know exactly who we want to work with. This is kind of like a metaphor to use here is like, you don't like decide who you want to date and they just date you or marry you, right? There's a two-sided equation there. You might know who you want to date and see someone that you're attracted to and go, cool, I want to marry that person or date that person. They've kind of got to reciprocate, right? They've also got to want you. So we had this like, oh, we've solved this. We know exactly who we want to work with. They didn't care. Also, when you've raised 10, 20, 30, $40 million, everybody wants a piece of you. So we knew who we wanted to work with. We couldn't necessarily articulate why they should work with us. We also couldn't get to these people. So we were like, Jesus, we've actually created a pretty big problem here. So the next piece of positioning is asking a much, much more difficult question, which is like, cool, I know who I want to work with. Why should they pick us over the other guys? What about us makes them particularly drawn to us? And you go through this very difficult realization that nobody cares about you or what you do or what you care about. It's a very painful thing. So we had deep care about the code quality, testing, process, all these things that our developers cared deeply about, that we thought our clients cared about. I went through a process that was really upsetting. We were sitting there at one stage thinking that our clients were coming to us because we were so awesome and we were great and our code control and all these things. And then I went and asked a few clients, hey, why did you come with us? Oh, you were the cheapest. And you sit there going, oh my God, we're building a business based on all of these assumptions. We've never asked our customers why they bought from us. Most clients I work with have never asked their customers, why did you buy from us? What about us made you choose us? It's a very scary question because until you've gotten deliberate about this, you're probably going to hear some shit you don't want to hear. But at least you know it then. Then you can begin this process of going, okay, what would we like? What would we need to look like for that target customer to make it an easy decision? To just choose us. And this is a very difficult and painful process, but Jesus, it is so useful. And you begin to actually start then understanding, okay, that's interesting. Our clients actually don't care about the things we care about. What do they care about? Interesting. They care about speed to market. Okay, interesting. At that point that they've raised that much money, they no longer care about costs so much. They care way more about velocity. Okay, interesting. So now we can start having a conversation based on what they want, not telling them all about us. No one likes to hear someone talking about themselves. No one. But we all love to talk about ourselves. That's why everyone comes on your podcast, Cam, because playing to ego. Hey, come and tell your story. Sure, I love it. Of course, you're human. You do. But that's not what people want to hear about. If people are resonating with anything I'm saying today, it's not because I'm talking about me. It's because they're going, Jesus, this guy's in my head. Oh my God, I'm experiencing exactly that. And that's what we've got to try and do from positioning. Figure out who we want to work with. Way more difficult. Figure out what we need to look like to make us an easy choice against the other guys. And just relentlessly focus on that. The concept comes up in a services business at this point of shifting from what David C. Baker calls a vendor to an expert. Okay? A vendor competes on one thing and one thing only. It's price. That is a bad position to be in. When you're competing on price, you have no leverage. You're commoditized. It's not a good place to be. When you can be perceived as an expert in the market, people come to you as a guide, as an expert. Help us get over or through this obstacle. The conversation shifts to value, not price. All of a sudden, you're seen as an expert in fintech and blockchain. You've got the creds to show it. You've got the track record. You can prove it. Suddenly, $70 becomes irrelevant. and people are prepared to pay $200. Why? Because you're the expert. Then you might say, well, how do you get that expert status? That's hard work. That's creating content. That's getting up on stage. That's putting yourself out there and going, we are the experts at this. This is how. Generate content, articles, podcasts, get up on stage, talk about it, create that expert status, and back yourself to have it. You've got to have it. If you don't have it, well, you need to get it, right? That process was incredibly difficult, very scary, very frustrating. We had some near-death experiences throughout that, for sure. We didn't know that we were right. That's why I said it's an exercise in courage, until we did. Hindsight 2020, it's easy for me to tell the story and make it sound easy and simple. It was terrifying at times. We had huge doubt at times. And we had to figure out, which is one of the best things we ever did, how to get to these people that don't want to be gotten to. And we figured out a very cool mechanism to do that. That's a whole nother story. That actually is what helped lead to the acquisition, actually. So positioning is, at least for me, probably one of the most underrated, misunderstood, and under-executed things, especially in services businesses. But my God, if you get it right, it changes everything, right? And we didn't even, let me be clear about this, like, we didn't get it right. We just started getting it a little bit less wrong. Like, we were acquired while we were on this journey and we were still learning. So like, just getting it a little bit less wrong had an outsized impact on our business. If we had continued with this sort of process, we would have just gotten better and better and better and better and better and better, right? It gets complicated when you have a much bigger business. I don't have experience in leading like 200-300 people businesses. It's not where my experience lies. It's a different set of problems there. But for like, let's say sub, I don't know, maybe 100 people businesses or sub, it's hard to pick a revenue number and like because of different types of models these days. But like in small or mid-sized businesses, especially in services, man, it's underlooked, it's undervalued because it's very difficult to do. But it is such an enormous lever to build incredible businesses and to get a rate on your, like a return on an hourly rate or a day rate that you just wouldn't have imagined possible. Like if I had said to the team, or if someone had said to me at the beginning of this journey, you would get to a point where you're billing that hourly rate, I would have just said like, there's no ways, man. That's not possible, right? So yeah, I'll stop there, Cam, and you know, let me know if you want to dig into any of it.
No, sure. I think what clicked for me and what you were talking about, and to tie this also into the conversation around doubt and imposter syndrome, is it's very easy to not have doubt or imposter syndrome if you're not putting yourself on the line as an expert in a specific niche. If you're saying we can do everything for anyone, it's very easy to say, okay, well, you're wrong, or you don't see the value, or you don't get it. But if you're having to commit to a niche and really committing to a specific positioning and dedicating how you're going to build your business towards that, you've now got nowhere to hide. You can't plead ignorance. And I think in that situation, you get humbled really quickly, but that's the birthplace for truly building a great business.
Yeah, and it really is terrifying at times, right? Because like we didn't start with where we ended. We explored we in logistics, and then we're a blockchain, and then we know we're not blockchain, we're fintech, and then we know we're not fintech, we're actually like all sorts of things, right? This was not it was not a linear process, right? And tons of doubt throughout that process. There's also other factors to consider that, you know, we had an incredible culture at NONA. Like I think if out of everything we did, that's probably the thing we did like the best, right? And there was a deep concern that, cool, we might be able to very clearly articulate why it makes sense to have this focus, but will everyone like it? Will everyone want to work in fintech and blockchain? Or will some people have, I don't know, ethical issues with it, or who knows what? Like, those are real things, right? Like, you spend enormous amounts of time and effort and energy building an amazing environment for people to do their best work, and that results in an amazing culture. Now you shift your focus, and let's pick something that is controversial. You suddenly decide that you want to, I don't know, be a specialist company that only deals with like lithium mining companies. And someone's like, I have a massive ethical issue with like mining. I don't want to work in this. Like, that is a real thing that can happen. And you can lose amazing people because you've got this incredibly logical positioning, but someone doesn't want to work in that. So there's like, it's not just like, there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of complexity, right? The other part of it is that, and maybe this will make people feel a little bit more courageous in doing this. You might be sitting thinking, but like, that was easy for you guys because you were experts in fintech and blockchain. We weren't. We were not when we began this. We backed ourselves to become expert really, really quickly. And we did. But you do have an element usually of a bit of a gap between when you set that positioning and when you truly actually become the expert. You just need to back yourself and ask the honest questions. Hey, we're probably not expert yet, but can we get there? Can we get there quickly? Will we do what it takes to get there quickly? If the answer is like, hell yeah, cool. Don't not do it because you sit there and go, oh, but we're not experts in that division. Oh, we're not experts in that division. Oh, we're not experts in that division. Without sounding cheesy, no one's ever an expert in the beginning. But you make that decision and you back yourself to get there. So we did that. On the blockchain side of things, we became one of the only businesses in the world that the actual protocols themselves would contract to do work for them. That might not mean anything to anyone listening to this, but that's a big deal. So like if anyone's into crypto, like Tezos was a client of ours. The co-founder of Ethereum was a client of ours. Verida was a client of ours. Like I can go on. Like that's not common, right? And when we started this, no one really knew anything about this stuff. But we backed ourselves to get there very, very quickly. And we did what it took to get there very, very quickly so that we could, hand on heart, say, we're expert, right? Again, positioning is more about marketing than it is about actual operations. But you need to be able to, hand on heart, be moving towards or get to the point where you can genuinely say you're expert or you will be found out. And then imposter syndrome is real because then you have been an imposter. But we need to get clear about where we are, what do we need to look like? Do we think we can bridge that delta? If we think we can bridge it, don't sleep until we do kind of thing. Hopefully that makes sense. Positioning is hard as hell. It is hard as hell, but it is very worthwhile investing time in.
You mentioned a lot about the positioning now. I think one side that goes hand in hand is you talk about needing to stand out and be the expertise and the best. And now we can get into the knowledge around differentiators, well, competitive advantage, really. So with this work on the positioning that you did, that's, I think, the first step towards standing out because it makes you specific. But what did you do to work on not just being specific, but being well differentiated enough that you're now attracting some of the best that want to work with you?
Simply put, we stopped talking about us, we started talking about them. Right? So, as I said earlier, it's this harrowing realization when you're like, no one cares about us. No one cares about us. Right? Your customers don't care about you. Your staff don't care about you. No one cares about you. What they care about is what can you do for them? So, if you're amazing at what you do, they don't care that you're amazing at what they do. They care that because you're amazing at what you do, that can alleviate a problem or help them get over or through or around a challenge or an obstacle. Before this positioning, it was all about us. We do this. This is our list of services. This is what we pride ourselves on. These are our values. Us, me, me, me. Post this, it was all about you. Do you experience this? Are these problems you're experiencing? Is this a pain point? We've got you. Here's how we do it, right? Now, don't become an infomercial, right? But the infomercials work for a reason because they're talking to the person. The best book I've ever read on this is a book called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. He then wrote another book called Marketing Made Simple, and then he built like an online university. I became a bit obsessed with this stuff. It's a little bit oversimplified, but the general sort of thing is based on Joseph Campbell's hero journey. You can go and Google that stuff too. It's very cool. The bottom line, stop talking about you and your features and your services and what you care about. Start being curious and understanding and asking your customers what they care about and talk about that stuff. I'll model this for you in an example. I used to write quite a lot on Medium. Okay? Medium, if you don't know, as listeners, it's kind of like a curated place where you write articles. It's really awesome. I wrote an article on should you or should you not outsource your software development. Okay? It did like fine. It was like nothing amazing. It was a pretty average article. Didn't perform amazingly well. I went to Sydney and I met up with an EO member and he gave me an exercise to do, which was such a great exercise. He calls it the 100 Fears exercise. You get into a room with your leadership team and you create like a rule and you say, we're locking the door. We're not leaving this until we have written down 100 fears, desires, insecurities of our target customer, right? It's easy to get to like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10. It's really hard to get to 100. Like you got to really dig deep and get creative. When you've got your 100, you'll notice that there's a bunch of categories. You'll probably have 5 or 6 or 10 themes. All right. But you spent an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours with the most important people in your business. That's really the value. You've been thinking and talking and agonizing and fighting and debating over what your clients care about, what they're scared of, what keeps them up at night, what drives insecurity, what are their desires. Once you have that list, you make a commitment to yourself to never, ever put out another piece of content about your business where you are not talking to one of those things. Just don't do it. Like as a rule, nothing else goes out ever unless we are talking to one of those things. I told you about this Medium article. As an experiment, I went and rewrote the Medium article. Could happen in 5 seconds now with ChatGPT, but that didn't exist then. I rewrote the article, same content, but I centered it around fears, centered it around desires, same content, but the headings changed. And I rewrote the content, same thing, but centered around fears and desires. In 24 hours, it got picked up by Medium, put on the other side of the paywall, which is what they do with the most popular articles. It was the most successful article I ever wrote on LinkedIn, on Medium. The same content. And I was just like, holy shit, this stuff really works. There was no difference in the content. The only difference was, first it was speaking about us, then it was speaking to their fears and insecurities. What happens here though, Cam, is that people, even if they get this far, they usually make a mistake. The mistake is they just guess these fears and insecurities. They guess the desires. They don't go and ask the goddamn client. Ask your client. Ask them what they care about. Ask them what keeps them up at night. Ask them why they bought from you. Ask them why they canceled the contract. Ask them why they renewed the contract. Don't guess. Don't make assumptions. So I hope that answers your question. That's what we did.
Yeah.
Not amazingly well. We didn't get it 100% right. We were still learning a lot, but it was a lot less bad than it was before. And that made an enormous difference.
100%. And I just love the story of the content piece, because I think that's a perfect metaphor for how positioning works, is that even from a business perspective, operations are identical, but you change the positioning to talk about the client, and it is the difference between going viral and being a mediocre piece of content. I'm not saying 100%. Your content's mediocre, but I mean in the perception of the people reading it. So now I really want to get into the scaling journey of NONA. And I know you're a big fan of scaling up. I mean, you read the book thoroughly. You were a huge student of that during your time at NONA. Can you talk to me about your scaling up journey in NONA, both the practically your actual scaling, but two is your journey also with the book?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we went through some very tough times at NONA. I think at the time I came across scaling up, I think we were technically insolvent at the time. We were having some real problems with one of our co-founders, who's a very, very smart guy, very capable guy. But, these things happen. We just sort of weren't necessarily aligned anymore. I think we were technically insolvent. I think I'd had to put money in what little I had into the business. The culture wasn't great at the time. There was toxicity. We were sort of going through a founder divorce. It was really not cool. It was not a fun time. And I think it was around that time. That was, I think, I don't know the exact, I think it was probably about 6 years into the business, probably something like that, 4, 5, 6 years into the business. We had grown a bit too quickly. We were losing money. We had if you're a services business listening to this that does projects, we had projects that we had been paid, or we were going to get paid, but we still had 60% of the work to do. It was just it was not a good situation. Like many founders, I read a hell of a lot. At that stage, I was reading at least a book a week and consuming all sorts of other content, like I'm sure many of you do. Then I came across Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. And my sense of this book was Jesus, this is every good management book I've read, condensed, and then put into a playbook that's just do these things. You don't have to think about it. And I had this amazing sense that oh my God, we've been inventing everything for the first time every time. We don't have to do that. There are far smarter people than us that have done this many, 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 many times, and it's documented. What we have to do is just get really, really good at execution. So I remember sitting in my kitchen with the remaining co-founders and saying to them, we probably had too much wine at the time. That was generally the theme at that time. Saying, all right, guys, here's this book. Pretty flippin' awesome. It's written by the co-founder of EO, which is a pretty good organization. His name's Vern Harnish. And Basically, it's a business operating system. So they recommend that you get a Gazelle's coach full-time to help you and takes 36 months to implement. Guys, either we're going to close the doors and admit defeat, or we're going to implement this by ourselves with no coach in 3 months. Which one should we do? Us being us, we were like, the hard one. Let's do the hard, stupid one. So we did the hard one. I don't want to make it sound easy, but it completely changed like everything. Having structure, stopping trying to figure everything out for the first time every time, just getting ultra good at execution and following a framework that is tried and tested just changed everything. If you read enough, and you read traction and scaling up and these sorts of things, if you read enough, you will start to see that like every single tool in those books is actually from somewhere else. I think that's genius. I don't see that as a bad thing. Their genius is just picking and choosing, simplifying through a deep understanding, and creating tools that anyone can use. They are not one size fits all as they post, but it's a damn good place to get started, right? It won't fix all your problems and there's nuance to everything, but it's a bloody good place to start. I'll tell you a funny story though, Cam. We try to implement scaling up like to the T, okay? We try to do like every single exercise, the face chart, the pace chart, the OPST, the critical number, like everything. Years later, I interviewed Vern Harnish on the podcast, right? The guy who wrote Scaling Up and the founder of EO. And I was like, Vern, I've got to ask you this. Do you have any clients that actually managed to implement this like 100%? Because that's what we try to do, and it was really hard. And he looked at me like I was nuts, and he was like, God, no, you're not like supposed to implement it like full out. Like, Jesus, man, if you're getting like 50, and I was just like, oh my God, I wish I had known this, And there's also a lesson in that, right? That like, just get started with execution. Stop trying to figure everything out for the first time every time. Most things you're doing in your business are not unique. Very few things that you're doing. I would almost venture to say probably nothing that you're doing in your business is truly unique. That should be liberating. Because then the question should not be, how do I do it? The question should be, who has done this at the highest level? Find the book. Read the book. Get really good at execution and emulating. That is how we had our successes. We just got exceptionally good at execution. It doesn't solve your strategy problems and like product development, right? But it'll get you a very, very far away, especially if you're in a services business. So we went from scaling up and we went on to traction. There's a whole story there. The work that I do now, I draw on both of those things a lot. They don't solve every problem. The tools are amazing, but you really need to understand them if you really want to get a lot from them. But, it's a great place to start, scaling up or traction. They're fantastic resources.
So now I'm a bit mixed up in terms of the chronology in my mind, is the fact that you went on this positioning journey, but you were almost insolvent as well. So I'm assuming that what happened is the other way around. You're almost insolvent, started implementing scaling up, realized that this solved a lot of your execution problem, but it didn't solve your strategy problem. And so obviously from a strategy problem, you started with positioning, and that's when things really took off. But the engine was ready for it, if I could put it that way, because you had gotten so good at execution because of scaling up.
That's a really good way to put it. So the sort of chronology is important. So this really terrible insolvent state temporarily and bad culture, that was before we got into the positioning stuff. I think an important thing to notice if you're going through positioning is while you're going through positioning, like you've got to take whatever work you take to keep the lights on. If it's like fire people and close the doors versus taking stuff in your niche, just take whatever the hell you need to take to keep the lights on. Like that's an important thing to understand, right? You move gradually towards, like, you should think of your clients as a portfolio. And initially you might have like 10% of your clients within your positioning, and then hopefully 20, and then hopefully 30. And then you should have a 3-year plan to say, hey, in 3 years, wouldn't it be amazing if 70% of our clients were within our niche? What I'm saying here, guys, is you don't flick a switch and all of a sudden you're only doing work for fintech. You progress towards that. Think of it like a portfolio. I didn't do that. I thought it was like we switch and we have to do that. And then we actually contracted David Baker to work with us. And he's like, no, you idiot. Like, if it's between like having bums on seats and not paying salaries, and you just take whatever the hell you have to take in the short term. Remember that saying? Sales fixes most things in the short term. That's like applicable here, but not in the long term. So you have this view of like, hey, wouldn't it be amazing, guys, if in 3 years' time, we're sitting at 90% of in niche customers? That would be an amazing goal. Let's work towards that. Think of it as a portfolio. So yeah, Cam, good observation there. I think it would have been borderline impossible to do this positioning work under that amount of duress. That was like full survival mode when we were sort of trying to rectify the situation and going through founder breakups. And, it's like a divorce. I mean, you spend more time with these people than you do your family. And it can get very, very emotional and really difficult and sad and intense. Anyone who's been through this will know what I'm talking about. We're fine now today, but it was a very intense, very traumatic time, to be honest. Again, I won't go down that rabbit hole now, but because of the identity, it's this ripping out of identity, right?
So we've spoken about two very critical, I'd say, catalysts in the journey of NONA now. The first time implementing scaling up, and essentially that helped prevent you from being insolvent, and then the positioning work that you did. It sounds like from there, I mean, obviously you mentioned the fact that you were able to 4x your pricing. You were now being a demand generating business, and the fact that you had like control of your pipeline. You're in this fantastic spot, right? I think just saying that out loud I was like, if I want to potentially acquire a business, do I want to do it when it's potentially insolvent and the founders all drunk around a table wanting to implement a book? Or am I going to do it when they've really figured out their positioning and, they are making money hand over fist? I think probably the latter. So what I want to know is, from that journey when things started looking really exciting, when did Yoco come around and how did that happen?
Yeah. So we were a services business, right? Services businesses in general are terrible business models, right? You are selling time for money. I want to just be clear about this. It's a terrible business model because it's not scalable. It doesn't mean you can't build a great business with great people and make a lot of money, but it's not a good business model because the only way you grow is putting people into the machine. That's not scalable, right? So what we sort of realized was our business model was like a 2 out of 10. When your business model is a 2 out of 10, it's just necessary for survival that your execution is really excellent. You can't be bad at execution when your business model is bad. You just can't. You just don't have the freedom because your margins are tight. There's no scalability. There's not zero marginal cost. You just have to be good at execution or you die. It's just that simple. So we had a terrible business model. We didn't know this at the time. We also didn't realize it, but we were actually exceptionally good at execution. One of my co-founders, Ed, particularly, is an absolute machine and was largely the reason we were so good at execution. But that was just a fact. Business model rubbish, execution has to be good. So business model is a 2, execution has to be like an 8. And I think our execution got to like a 9, I would say. We got exceptionally good at execution, but it was still a bad business model. Okay. So what does a services business do when they realize this? They generally go, we need to get into product. We're making money by building product for other people. Surely we can just build our own product. Not quite that simple, right? I won't go down on a tangent on this, but anyone who thinks that anyone who has a services business right now that wants to get into product, stop calling it a product and call it a second business because that's what it is. There's no such thing as building a product.
Mm-hmm.
There is a thing of starting another business that is a product. It's going to need go-to-market. It's going to need leadership. It's going to need resources. It's going to need to have separate IP. It is a business. Don't make the mistake we made of thinking it's not a business. So many false starts on this. Generally what would happen is I would find myself at 2:00 in the afternoon having done no work on NONA because I'm just working all this time on this product. It's not a product. It's a business. It's a distraction. So we failed at that. We did not get that right. We did not get the move from services to product right. We tried a few times, failed dismally. Stop trying to do it. So then we were like, well, we're a services business. And if we want to exit, we're not going to get a high multiple as a services business. How do we get a strategic valuation, right? This was a strategy that happened way quicker than we expected. But basically, long story short, and again, I'm paraphrasing something that took years to figure out. We were a bit slow. Hopefully you're faster than us. But we sort of had this belief that was like, okay, our best chance of reaching a strategic valuation is to have a client that is extremely well funded. Most of our clients were at that stage. Most of our clients now have raised lots of money, and often over many hundreds of millions of dollars. Becomes so valuable to that client that it just makes like perfect sense for them to acquire us, that they almost like can't not acquire us, right? And that way we have a better chance of getting a much higher valuation. This was not like a set strategy. It was just like conversations we had that made sense. It wasn't like, there wasn't this war room scenario where we were like, yes, that's what we're going to do. But it was a general sentiment in the leadership of the business. Like, this is kind of what we're going to do. I mentioned to you earlier that our target client was very, very, very difficult to get to. We figured out a way to get to them, which worked really well. It was really neat. We started a podcast. We started a podcast called The FinTech Founder Journey. This podcast, I didn't care at all about the guests. Apologize if any of you were listeners. I didn't care about you as a listener. I really didn't. The only reason we started this podcast was we played into the human ego. If I messaged, who's an example? I don't know, Anthony Delorio, co-founder of Ethereum. And I say to him, hey man, we're a software development company. Can we talk to you about doing your software? I mean, about a 0.5% chance that he even responds, right? However, if you send a message to someone saying, hey, Anthony, amazing on the most recent update of your business or the raise or the product, well done. I'd really love to interview you to get your insights and your story on building Ethereum. Would you come on the FinTech Founder Journey podcast? Here are some of the other guests that we've had. 9 out of 10 people will say yes, right? Because we all like to talk about ourselves. We do. So we had this amazing channel to these incredibly difficult to get to people. I got Fred Shabesta on there, Forbes Rich List, co-founder of Finder.com, co-founder of Ethereum, top VCs, founder of EO. I mean, I got a senator on the podcast to talk about blockchain regulation. Like, it was just so easy to get people to come and talk about themselves. I'd research the hell out of them, and I would really make it a good interview. Like, I'd put a lot of effort into it to give it a good experience. But an amazing thing would happen in this podcast. 1, I got to speak to them for half an hour as a prep and build rapport. But 2, when we were recording, if anyone's been in a podcast, you'll know how it works. Please close all windows. Please put your phone on silent. Please make sure there's no distractions. Please be fully dialed in. You never, ever get somebody fully dialed in. But when you're recording a podcast, you do. So most podcasts top and tail their podcast with a pre-recorded intro and a pre-recorded outro. I didn't do that. I would read my intro because my intro was basically an elevator pitch. So I would have their undivided attention. They didn't even know that they were being sold to. So they were very open. It was very subtle. And I would just talk about for 30 seconds what NONA did, credibility, and what we specialized in. And obviously what we specialized in was the type of company that the target guest was a part of. Then I would interview them. I would be very well researched. I'd make it a really good experience. I wouldn't sell anything. A lot of them would go, what is it that you said you guys do? Oh man, we must talk, right? So we had this podcast that was hugely successful from that perspective. Got a lot. It actually did very well from a downloads perspective, but genuinely, I didn't care about the audience. Like I didn't. It was just about the founders. The audience helped to get founders on. If I said, hey, we had 10,000 downloads, that helped with credibility, but that was the only reason. My current podcast, different story. That's all about the listener, not about the guest, right? To illustrate my point, the day we sold NONA, we killed the podcast. It had a job to do. It did the job. It's done. It's gone. Right. I think they're still on YouTube, but it's not hosted. It was a tool. So coming back to the Yoco story, I got Lungi, one of the co-founders, CTO, very cool guy, onto the podcast. We kind of knew each other, but not really. Had a really good interview. He's a super impressive guy. And almost needless to say, off the back of that, we started doing work with them. Right, it was just such an obvious fit. They're local in South Africa. We were there. We kind of knew each other. We had a good reputation. We started building stuff for them. That team grew and grew and grew and grew to the point that it was almost becoming a bit of a client concentration risk. We've been there. It's scary. We didn't want to be there again. Just a quick anecdote, a side story. At one point, we had more than 90% of our revenue coming from one client. That was a scary place to be. Yeah. Try not to be in that position. It wasn't Yoco. It was a US client, but that was not a fun place to be. That team grew and grew and grew. Eventually, sort of the conversation just accelerated really, really fast. They had raised a lot of money. They had a talent problem. The talent market was at an all-time high. It was incredibly difficult to find talent. Funding was very cheap. It was just a perfect storm. We got very, very, very lucky. I'm not really allowed to talk about the numbers and things, but we got a valuation that we definitely wouldn't get today because the market has changed considerably from a capital perspective and a talent perspective. We wouldn't have gotten a year before that. We got exceptionally lucky with the timing of the market. We acknowledge that, but it just made a lot of sense at the time. So we were acquired at a valuation that is far higher than we would ever have got in an ordinary multiple of EBITDA. Like it's like so much higher. And it was because of the positioning. And it was because of the lever that we figured out to pull to get to these difficult to get to people. And it was about using language that appealed to them, not us. And we got an incredible result. I can't stress enough that there was an element of luck, 100%, 100% pure and utter luck. However, luck is everywhere, guys. It's everywhere. You need to be ready to capitalize on luck. You need to be ready to move quickly. I mentioned earlier that we had a data room way before we needed it. What I mean by this, when they were doing their due diligence, they were like, hey guys, sorry, exhaustive list. Do you think you could get this back to us? And I don't know, I think they said 2 weeks. Jared was like, give me 10 minutes, I'll share the folder. What the hell? What the hell? Why do you have this information? Who else is looking? Right? So yes, there was luck, for sure, 100% luck, but we were ready to capitalize on it. So if you're listening to this and you're going, oh, that was lucky, it was lucky. My question to you is like, luck is everywhere, all the time. How do you ready yourself to capitalize on luck when it comes? That's a big question to ask yourself. Like, what does being ready to capitalize on luck look like? What kind of luck? Where does it come? What would we do? These are important questions to ask yourself, depending on your stage. So they acquired us, a very interesting deal. I'm not really allowed to talk about the detail too much, but it was a very unconventional deal. Happened really quickly. We sort of dissolved the business, handed all of our clients over to other providers. And, the rest is history, so they say.
Reminds me of another quote that I really like is that success is where preparation and opportunity meet. So,
yeah,
Mike, you've now exited NONA, right? And now you're working as the head of partnerships at Yoco. What was that like to now go and work for someone else for the first time? And specifically, the people that acquired you as well, whilst still having your entire team now move over into that business. Like that must have been tricky.
Yeah. It wasn't great for me, and that's no disrespect to anyone, any business. It was circumstantial. So when we were doing the business, it was really, when we were doing the deal, it was really easy to track where every single person was going to go. Right? They were acquiring effectively the talent in the business and the capability. My role at NONA was effectively two things. It was leading the leadership team, so leading a very, very competent, smart, capable leadership team, and getting the most out of them, which is a very difficult thing to do, but I love that, and I love those people. And the second one was effectively business development. We never solved outsourcing business development. I tried very hard to get other people to do it. It just never worked. So I was kind of responsible for business development and leading the leadership team, right? And in there is wrapped up in strategy and culture and all that stuff. Everyone was easy to map over to Yoco, really easy, except me. And when we were doing this process, I said to them, and I think they thought I was being falsely humble, I said, I don't think there's a role for me at Yoco. I want to come, but I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I'm not going to be the CEO. It's not going to happen. I don't have those capabilities. I've never done anything like that. I'm not going to get into sales because it's a very different kind of business. It's a product company. It's got nothing to do with the kind of business development I've done. I'm not a developer. I'm not a designer. I'm not a product lead. What am I going to do? Like, honestly, what am I going to do? I've never worked in a company before. I've never been employed in my life. As Cam mentioned at the beginning, this was the first time in my life I'd ever signed an employment contract at 40 years old, right? I don't know how to be led. Okay. I was excited about it, but I don't know how to do it. So it wasn't great. They generously created a role for me that didn't exist before and doesn't exist now. So once I left, there is no head of partnerships anymore, and there wasn't before. It wasn't clear to me, not through any lack of theirs. The business has gone through a lot of change. If you follow the Yoco story, I won't talk about it, but it's quite public, so you can figure out what's happened there. It's an amazing success story with lots of change. So it wasn't great. It also wasn't great for me because I'm in Australia. It's 5:45 in the evening now. It's morning for you, Cam. It's one thing leaving South Africa with an established team, an established business, an established culture, and going to then leave and go and carry on from Australia. It's a whole nother thing starting and trying to lead people you've never met and integrate into a company from Australia with an 8 or 9 hour time zone, other side of the world, very different energy cycles of the day. It was really not pleasant for me. Like, I was on calls, my day would kind of start from a calls perspective at like 3 p.m. and I'd have like 5 hours of Zoom calls back to back into the evening. I've got young kids, not fun, like not a good fit, right? They tried very hard to accommodate me. Like, I'm very grateful for that. They were very generous. It wasn't a good fit. It wasn't a good fit. So tried very hard, built a small little team in the partnerships area, very cool people, a small team of 3 people. Long story short, I couldn't travel either. So I only met the founders of Yoco, the guys who acquired our company. I only met them a year and a half after the deal concluded. It's just a bizarre situation. Like, I'm 6'5", and it was just weird because, like, when they met me, they're like, Jesus, I didn't realize you were so tall. I've only ever seen you on a screen. Like, what the hell, man? Like, I must have heard that 200 times when I went to the office. Like, oh my God, I didn't realize how tall you were. Like, and it's just a weird thing, right? Because it's like, you don't know each other really.
Yeah.
You've had every interaction over a screen. It's kind of shitty. Like, you never actually hung out with these people. So, like, the first time I went to planning, very graciously and a very amicable situation, we sort of decided, this very, very amicably, and they were super generous with how we separated everything. We decided, look, that, probably isn't a good role for you here. We spoke about a different role. They wanted me to join sort of the senior team, potentially in a totally different role. But immediately we were just, Lungi and I were talking, like, look, that's cool. I can see that value, but no ways I can do that from Australia. And they were like, yeah, we'd want you to relocate. And like, I'm not going to relocate the family. So we sort of said, well, I guess we're done. And it was super amicable. They were way more generous than they needed to be. And I wrapped up everything in November. So, a little sad that it didn't work out because I wanted it to. And that was hard for me to accept. And I don't feel like I actually experienced Yoco because I just spent far more than 90% of my time on the other side of a Zoom screen, where actually I wanted to immerse myself in that culture, and they built an incredible business. I mean, that story is just out of control, impressive with what they've achieved. But sadly, it wasn't a good fit. So that brings us, that brings us to today, where the deal is done. We are exceptionally grateful and lucky to have gotten that timing so right. It would not be the same deal now because the markets have changed considerably. Money is a lot more expensive. The talent market has cooled off considerably. You all know about the layoffs that have happened across pretty much every tech company in the world and continue to. So, very lucky, very grateful, great commercial outcome. Acquisitions are difficult. It's very difficult to integrate one company into another company. I've learned a lot about that. Don't know what I would do differently, but I've really seen a different side to these things, which is very interesting. It's also been amazing to observe a high growth company like Yoco at that scale and having quite a close sort of connection to the founders, especially one or two of them, to observe that kind of massive scale firsthand. That's been phenomenal. And I'm kind of left today with a pretty clear picture of where I fit very well. I'm not a big business guy, and I'm okay with that. I'm not a multi-100 person business guy. It's not actually where I thrive. I'm a small and mid-sized business guy. I love working with founders and leadership teams and on businesses that are like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, that are growing, that are tight feedback loops, where things are still small and tight and fast, and we can affect change and it happens really quickly. I'm not a big business guy. And that was actually really useful for me to realize that, because I didn't know that before. So yeah, tons of learnings, some very smart people there. Did it go exactly how I wanted it to? No, but like nothing ever does. Would I have changed anything? Would I still have done it? Absolutely. It was the right thing to do. Like 100% that was the right thing to do. No doubts, no regrets at all. But everything can be done better. And acquisitions are difficult. They are exceptionally difficult. Pulling off an acquisition and an integration from one company into another company is so multi-layered, so nuanced, so many cultural things. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I think it's left me with a newfound respect of like people who pull off these M&A deals successfully and how incredibly tricky it actually is. I can't speak too much about the detail. It's just not okay to do that. But yeah, it's like amazing experience. And I think, was it like never work again money? No, because there were multiple shareholders in the business. Was it a significant valuation? Yes, like very significant, especially in Rand terms. But it feels like a beginning, not an end. So like it's kind of every entrepreneur's sort of dream to like build the business, scale the business, exit the business, be acquired. It's an amazing end to the story. It feels incredible that like with some of the people I love the most in the world, we went to war together, suffered incredibly together, and had this incredibly positive outcome where the story ended very, very well. Do I feel that this is like the highlight of my career and the biggest thing that'll ever happen? Absolutely not. Do I want to start another business from scratch? Probably no. Do I want to join an existing business or invest in a business or buy in a business with people that I want to work with? Probably yes. So weirdly, actually, the takeaway from me from this is don't start another business. Buy another business, join another business, help another business go from good to great. Which interestingly, when I was interviewing Vern Harnish, I think it was actually off the record, I said to him, what advice would you give, a new entrepreneur to start a business? He's like, don't start a business, buy one. This is the guy who wrote Scaling Up. This is the guy who started the Entrepreneurs Organization. He's like, I'm not even kidding. Don't start a business. It's too hard. Buy one and take it from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100 or 5 to 20. So yeah, that's kind of in a very short nutshell, the ending story of NONA.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for the candor that you could provide with what you could share. So, if it's not clear to anyone right now, Mike's also now in coaching. I think that's been abundantly obvious. So, just speaking to the present, I mean, that's what you're up to now. What does just the next couple of months look like? And if someone wants to get in contact with you, where could they go?
Yeah, so look, I live in Adelaide in Australia now. So, what I'm doing at the moment is, I don't know what to call it. Like, it's something between coaching, advisory, consulting, facilitation. Basically, the short version is I have two sort of things that I'm doing. I either work with leadership teams to help them implement a lot of the tools and processes and frameworks that we did. That's kind of ring-fenced to being in person. It doesn't really work over Zoom so well. But then I also have one-on-one coaching, which I'm absolutely loving. So I work with founders of small and mid-sized businesses very deeply on the sort of thesis is like, it's got a very, very strong business bent and it's centered towards business. But the whole thing is what I've been talking about is that like we work together on you as the asset. Once you have all of your pieces together and you're working on yourself, you're going to be a better leader, a better husband, wife, father, daughter, whatever the case may be. So it's business focused, but it's really working on the individual. And I'm loving that work. And that I do with anyone, anywhere in the world, because Zoom is actually fantastic for that. So that's what I'm doing now full time. What's coming next? I won't stop doing coaching. I've been doing it for a long time. I've only been doing it full time since November, but I've been doing it for about 5 years, on the side. I love it. It was something that I always have done and I'll continue to do. But I also want to be part of building something meaningful again with great people. So I won't stop the coaching thing. That will continue. But I'm actually talking to a company at the moment, potentially going to join them. Very, very cool founder. Love this guy, respect this guy, great business. We had some dealings with them at NONA. It was fantastic. So potentially maybe going to join a business, but don't know what that looks like yet. And then we'll see. We'll see. I have, as Jim Collins says all the time, first get the right people on the bus, then decide where you're going. I feel very fortunate now because I have a group of people that are exceptional operators that I trust and love, that have got a proven track record, that have got some capital behind us now, and we just need to figure out what to do. So, a lot of these people are still at Yoco. There's no rush. They've got a time that they've got to be there. It's not like we'll do anything in the next 6 months, but there'll come a time when we'll want to do something new. And there's this amazing thing now that like we have the people, we have the track record, we have the capital. So what do we do next? And that's an amazing place to be. So the next 6 months, probably not much, Cam. The next year, maybe have started something. The next 2 years, be surprised if I'm not sort of being significant part of building something. But I'll continue doing this coaching stuff because I just love it. And as much as I feel like I'm giving a lot of value, I'm just learning so much at the same time and get so much fulfillment from working with these just awesome people that want to continually build themselves and their business and just bring value into the world. So that's where I am at the moment.
Yeah, and it's very clear that you do love it. I mean, that I can tell, emanating from you. Mike, the final question that I have is, what's the one question that I haven't asked you, that I should have asked you, that you'd like to answer now?
Oh, man. I don't really want to answer this, but I think a good question would have been like, what's the biggest failure? Like what is the thing that you just really messed up with? And how might you do it differently? I don't really know what the answer is right now, Cam. But
That's fine.
But like, it's a question that It's a question that I actually haven't reflected on, weirdly, that just came to me now. I think that's a good question. I don't have an answer for it. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've failed a lot of the time. So I'd have to really think about that. But that's a powerful question.
I'll wait for that voice note when you figure out what the answer is. Mike,
No problem.
Until then, thank you for being on the Founder Files. Can't wait to see you just keep adding way more value to other founders. And yeah, I'll chat to you soon.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun. Cheers, Cam.
There are a few things I love more than the unfiltered candor and honesty from a founder about what their experiences have actually been like, what they actually think, and how this has shaped them. And this is one of those situations. So to not take away from anything Mike has said, my 3 things I'm taking away from this conversation is identity, positioning, and curiosity. How you view yourself shapes all of your decisions and how you behave. If you don't put in the work to really understand that, your subconscious will dictate your life in ways that you don't yet understand. Positioning, that's, I'd say, the identity of business, but in the eyes of the market, that's everything. I mean, it's the difference between being seen as too expensive to 4xing your pricing and having clients waiting in the wings to work with you in Mike's case. Taking the time to really think through the pains and desires of your target customers and speaking to those. There's few things that will pay off as well as that in terms of strategic thinking. And finally, curiosity. We are constantly students. We're never not learning. And the other side of that is feeling like you already know and have figured it out is the main thing that gets in the way of being open to learning. And I thought that was very insightful. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, then please remember to follow and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and engage with us on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what lessons you took away from this podcast, what else you want to hear about, and what other founders you'd love to hear from next. Until next time, cheers.